Welcome, guys, back to the Grateful Living podcast. Today, I'm thankful to have Steve Pemberton with me. Steve is the Chief Human Resources Officer at Workhuman, the leading online platform bringing positivity to the workplace through social recognition. Prior to Workhuman, Steve was the Global Chief Diversity Officer at Walgreens Boots Alliance and Chief Diversity Officer at Monster. Steve is also the best-selling author of A Chance in the World, a book he published in 2012, and The Lighthouse Effect, a book he published in 2021. Steve is also the husband of Tonya and the proud parent of three children. Steve, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for coming on. For people that might not know your story, can you kind of take us back to the beginning? You know, where you grew up, your family situation, what type of kid you were, things like that.
Well, I won't take you back to the very beginning. That would take entirely too long, but I can certainly give you the highlights.
Yeah.
And so much of the story is actually contained in the title of the first book, A Chance in the World. The title came from the diary entry of a babysitter who encountered me when I was 1.5 years old. And he said of me, in essence, there's no way he can overcome this. He doesn't have a chance in the world. And this that he was referring to was that my mother was in the middle of a losing battle with alcoholism. My father was not identified by her, nor did he claim responsibility. So it did appear that prediction was going to come true. And the fact that I wound up with a chance in the world after all, even though I was taken from my mother about a year after that prediction was made, I was to never see her again. And it got even more difficult after that, but somehow managed to get through these very difficult foster homes, find my way to college. And when I graduated from college, went looking for my biological family and found them.
Yeah. Awesome. So you mentioned it in there, and people that read the book will learn, you obviously grew up in the foster care system. Um, I'm curious, as you look back at that experience, for someone looking up to you who's in that system right
Mhm.
now, um, obviously there's multiple parts to it. But is there any piece of advice that you would say to that kid?
In many ways, I wrote the book, both of them, as much for that younger version of me. Certainly wasn't for the adult version of me because life wonderfully so turned out well. However, I'm reminded of what was hanging in the balance for me at that age, 8 years old, 12 years old, 16 years old. And had I read a story like mine at any of those ages, it would have had a transformative effect on my life. And that would summarize the advice that I would offer, that you're not alone. It's not just you. It may feel that way. That there is a skill set that you have, a value that you have, and the ability to shift and your mindset away from what may be the victim to the possibility of being a victor is because of the life experiences that you've had. And a really good example of this is the narrative of the orphan, which transcends cultures, actually. Most of the superheroes that we know all have one thing in common. They were orphans. Wonder Woman, Batman, Spider-Man, Superman, Frodo Baggins, Jane Eyre, Harry Potter, Little Orphan Annie. I mean, you can just keep going.
Yeah.
Right. So why is it that you have that kind of right? What is it about the orphan that has such a hold in culture? And it's the strength of the orphan, actually, that they have this deck stacked against them, that it appears that society has given up on them, or they find themselves on the periphery, and yet they have this real ability and power to transform their life. That's why it's the common denominator of superheroes and superheroes too. And there's something instructive for any young person to take from that idea of the orphan as a superhero, that's applicable to our own life. And you know, and that's how I pronounce your name, right, Arnav?
Arnav, yeah.
Yeah. And so what I would say to young people is, let's find your superpower. Let's find your superpower. What is it? Is it music? Is it art? Is it painting? Is it sport? Is it literature? Is it writing? Is it engineering? Is it being an inventor? What's your superpower? Could you have one? Now we got to help you find it. So my superpower was reading. That was my superpower. And I was better at it than just about anybody else my age at that time. And it transformed my life.
Yeah. There's a point at which you, for background info for people that don't know, but he basically was in a situation where you were getting, physically, mentally, emotionally abused. There's a point at which you obviously tell on your foster parents,
Yes.
to the social worker and things like that. I'm curious what got you to that breaking point. Obviously they were emotionally trying to use, introducing your parents to you against you and things like that. But what was that breaking point to say, this is too much?
I remember that very specifically. It was when I come home from school. I had decided that I was going to college, even though they kept telling me that I wasn't going to go to college. They weren't going to complete forms for me. They weren't going to do anything to help me. And I remember coming home with the form to get a fee waiver to take the standardized tests, the PSAT. And the foster mother refused to fill out that form. And of course, my guidance counselor had told me, Steve, if you want to go to college, you have to take the SAT. And here she was telling me no. And at that point, I realized that they'd already taken a childhood from me. I had been living with them for 11 years, and they had been masterful at presenting me to the world as this broken child who had troubles and difficulties, but they were doing their best, when the reality was that they were the broken ones, actually. And in that moment, I realized, they had taken my childhood. I mean, I didn't do things like go on play dates and have sleepovers and play Little League baseball without them pulling me off. I had to quit the high school sports teams that I joined. They had taken any semblance of a normal childhood, but in telling me that they weren't going to complete the forms for me to go to college, they were trying to take my future too. And that I was not going to allow. I was not going to allow that.
Yeah. This is a tough question, but is there a way for teachers, social workers, or anybody that's an adult, not your foster parents, to spot signs that you think a kid is getting abused?
there's the instincts that we have as adults about situations. It says, something's not quite right there. Something's not right. The number of people who I met much later on in life who knew that there's something was not quite right about my situation, that's a long line of people. It's a long line. And so I would say, one, follow your instincts. If you see a child who is coming to school in the middle of summer with long sleeve shirts on constantly, who's withdrawn, letting your instincts ask, the probing questions. By and large, when you hear these stories of terrible situations unfolding in abusive homes, somewhere along the chain, somebody knew. School nurse, teacher, gym teacher, high school coach, somebody knew or suspected. And the unwillingness to act. And Arnav, in a lot of cases, costing these children their lives.
Yeah.
Costing these children their lives.
Yeah.
And so there is, to me, a lot to be said for following, that instinct, because there is so much hanging in the balance. I mean, literally, that child's life's hanging in the balance.
Yeah. Speaking of that, obviously one of the interesting things about reading your story is your ability to continue to perform well in school while you're, compoundingly year after year getting abused. How did you do that? Were you just compartmentalizing? And, as you look back from the psychology perspective, how did you do that?
In a couple of ways. The first was that I had a very different vision for my life than the one that they were trying to imprint upon me. They were trying to tell me that I had no value in the world, that I wasn't wanted by my mother and father, that I was, not to be impolite about it, but that I was going to be worthless. The challenge with the effort that they were making was that it was falling on deaf ears, because I already had armor on, and the armor came from reading, and from reading came that vision of a different life than the one that they were trying to assign to me. So that meant doing well in school, and doing well in school was an act of defiance. It was my way to defy them. And that kept me sane mentally. And I think there was a certain idealism, Arnav, that also came from reading. I saw love, I saw caring, I saw laughter, I saw intact families. I saw everything that I was not experiencing. So I knew it existed. And my mindset pivoted more to, so what does one do? Like, how do you find that out in the world? So I think the importance of pivoting and moving from the circumstance, because the circumstance oftentimes is not your creation, to the possibility. So it's true for us as individuals. It's true the slightest of problems. Going to work, car breaks down. That's the circumstance. What's the possibility? How can I still get to work? Pull over, call an Uber, right? And to the degree there's any secrets, it's how much time do you spend moving from the circumstance to the possibility? For me, it's like this, really quick. And even then, the amount of time that I'll spend looking at a problem or a circumstance is only so that I can fully understand it, so I can begin developing solutions. It's a common quality amongst leaders, effective leaders, I should say. They pivot. They understand the circumstance. They're trying to pivot. Nobody told me that. It's just something that I found and discovered along the way. That was invaluable to me. And I think the other was the affirmation that came from school. So, I mean, they worked really hard to tell me that I was stupid, but that didn't fly either because I was getting straight A's. They wanted to double promote me. I was winning the spelling bee. Even my classmates who teased me for being a bookworm, like that was a compliment to me.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that, and I'd say for any of us find ourselves in situations, not just as, young people in foster care, but these things can happen and unfold later on in life too. How fast do you pivot? How much can you reframe the vision? And if you're one who is providing for a foster child or trying to help a friend, that's our responsibility. How can I help you pivot?
Yeah. I'm curious, did you ever consider suicide?
I didn't. I didn't know what it was, actually, to be honest. It was not
Oh,
something unlike today where, you grew up. In fact, I couldn't really remember when I first heard about suicide. Um, but even if I had, I don't think that would have been a path I would have pursued because I would have felt that would have meant them winning. And I could not let them do that.
mm,
Like they weren't going to win no matter what. Like that was very, very important to me. Like really, probably the single most important thing to me. So much so that the day I left that home, I went back to confront them with my social worker because I had to let them know that I was the one who had orchestrated my release all along. Having said that, I still believed that at any point I was going to die because they told me that I would die. And that if I ever told anybody what was happening, they would remind me on a near daily basis. You know, kids like you disappear all the time and nobody asks any hard questions. So, be careful who you're talking to and what you're saying. It's quite a weight to walk through the world with when you're 9, 10, 11 years old.
yeah. Um, Faith, it's interesting, um, reading your story, um, just if I was in your shoes, there's no way I'd believe in God. You were
Mm.
given so many tough circumstances, for 11 years of your life. How did you remain, or how did you, remain faithful, or how did you see the good? Like, how is that possible?
In a couple of ways. One was I saw evidence of faith around me, though. I did see miracles, um, and I saw them sometimes directed at me. The only time I went to church, there was one time I went to church, and we walked into this sanctuary, and it was enormous. I mean, I'm sure it was probably, bigger than a house, but to me, it was enormous. And all the children gathered in the foyer of the church. We walk in, and we're going to be standing in front of the congregation. It's a Baptist church. And we walk up to the front of the church, kind of the pews on either side. And right in front of us is the pulpit that's elevated. And behind the pulpit is a cross. And over the top of that cross, lit up, were the words, "God is love." And they told us to all turn around and face the congregation. But I don't. I am transfixed on this cross. And the reason that I'm transfixed is because Willie Robinson, the foster father, who was my tormentor, built that cross.
Wow.
So in that moment, Arnav, I remember thinking, they fooled my social workers, they fooled my teachers, they fooled the neighbors, and now they fooled God too. Now, in that moment, all could have seemed lost, right? God doesn't even see what's happening to you. Not even God sees. How does a young person recover from that? Well, here's how. We wave to the congregation applauds. We're brought down into the basement of the church where they're having Sunday school. And when we're all gathered, the teachers, Sunday school teachers, separated you by whether or not you had been to church before. And I was like 9 years old. And they put me in a class with 5-year-olds. So I'm bigger than them. And they start teasing me and ridiculing me. The desk was too small. I remember my knees banging on the desk.
Yeah.
And the Sunday school teacher says, okay, everybody, bow your head in prayer. And I raised my hand and I said, how do you do that? And again, these 5-year-olds, 5 or 6-year-olds, they're snickering at me, they're laughing. And she calms the class down. And she says, now, class, and everybody goes quiet. And she says, I don't think that's what he meant. And she looked at me and she said, is it? And I said, no, ma'am. And she said, you can talk to God the same way that you would talk to a best friend. And I said, will anybody else hear you? Because remember, you tell anybody what's happening to you, you're going to disappear.
Mm.
And so when I said, will anybody else hear you? And she said, oh, absolutely not. Whatever you say to God stays between you and him. And that was the miracle in the moment. And so from that day to this day, I've prayed. And it's given me understanding. It's given me peace. It's giving me an ability to accept the things that I cannot change, because it's helped me realize that the things I cannot change are intended for another purpose, you know? And so my entire life, as far as I'm concerned, is a reflection of faith. My entire life, there's no other explanation for it. You know, it's not because I'm some extraordinarily talented, gifted individual who's cornered the market on resilience and grit. I don't think that's it. I think it's the essence of faith.
Yeah. After you move in with John Sykes, I'm curious, was there a period of like PTSD, of like fear of going back or fear of running into them, or any, like, would that, I mean, obviously it was great because you were free from them. But those like next 4 months or whatever it was, 6 months of that, just the initial beginning process, do you remember feeling, I don't know, like nightmares or anything like that?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It would be years before I would sleep normally through the night, years, because I was often snatched out of bed. I was always concerned that somehow the circumstances would change and I would be taken back. And that feeling never really evaporated until I went to college and knew I would never go back. I remember that first night I did not sleep. I moved, in essence, from being in the city out to the country. And that night, on occasion, a car would come down the road, not often, but often enough. And I would literally get up from the cot that I was sleeping on. John had a cot. And I would get up and I would go over by the window and I would hide behind the curtains. And I would watch the car, making sure that it would go past. And I remember thinking in my mind, what do I do? You know, what do I do if they pull in here? Like, what do I do? And it took me a while to realize that, that they weren't coming. And then I think as I got a little bit older, especially when I got to college, I came to see them for what they were, which were bullies and very insecure people who were taking out their world frustrations on me. But the fear, the physical stuff, I had been so toughened against that it didn't bother me. But the fear was the last emotion to go. That sense that, that I was going to be okay. That took a long, long time to find.
Steve, if there's someone out there right now struggling with resolve, right? Obviously, when I asked you, obviously you didn't get to any close point of suicide or anything like that. But if there's someone out there that's, struggling with keeping their resolve or their faith in believing that a brighter day is ahead in the future, is there something you would say to them?
There's a lot that I would say. But there's much more that they can do. Because I think when you're in that desperate a situation, circumstance, Arnav, I'm not sure that anything anybody says to you is going to be that moment that turns you around. I think it's as much about putting yourself in situations and experiences that allow you to see this deeper sense of value that you have. I also think that part of developing resolve is trying to help people in whatever way you can, just as you are, with all the pain that you're feeling, all the hurt. Your life's still valuable, and there is somebody who can benefit from your journey and experience. And I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I asked, John, what was the conversation like between he and my social worker when my social worker called him saying, hey, can Steve come stay with you? And he said that, in essence, he said, I was trying to convince God that I wasn't good enough to take you in. So he says, I'm talking to your social worker in one ear, but I'm having a conversation over here saying, God, I love teaching and I can be a great teacher, but I can't take in a 16-year-old boy, and especially not somebody who's been through what he's been through. And he also says, and God, you and I both know I have a problem with alcohol. I'm an alcoholic. And so I can't do this. Can't do it. So imagine, where his head was. And I said, well, what did God say back to you? And he said, well, what I heard was, you may not trust you, but I trust you. And besides, this young man is out of options. You're it. You're it. Because he was it. He was it. There was nowhere. They called everybody that day. They called everybody. It's 3 days after Christmas. I'm 16. I'm Black. I'm male. I'm hard to place any time of the year, let alone in the midst of the holidays. And here this lighthouse appears out of nowhere. And John was very much a lighthouse. He was battered, as lighthouses are. He was vulnerable, as lighthouses are. He had scars, as lighthouses do. And yet still they stand there, resolved. But their resolution is not necessarily about themselves. It's about you. That's why they stand as resolutely as they do. Because they're not even sure they have the strength to stand for themselves, but they can take a stand for somebody else. And so I think that's part of that pivot that I talked about, earlier. And the last thing on that question, I would say, if you can go back to any moment in your life that was a real downer, right? I don't know, cut from an athletic team, got rejected by somebody, And when you think about it, you're like, wow, that really, really hurt. But now you're a few years older, a few years wiser, and you realize, one, that wasn't that bad, right? And in fact, not only wasn't that bad, but I'm glad that that happened, because look at all the other things that have unfolded for me. So the pain that we might be dealing with, the suffering through, is just, it's a momentary thing. It will not endure forever.
Yeah. So, after high school, you went to Boston College. It's a terrific school, but there's a lot of, middle class and upper class individuals.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, how was your adjustment with, the socioeconomic difference of Chestnut Hill versus New Bedford, and maybe even the racial, um, being a minority. How was adjusting to college?
There wasn't any single part of it that wasn't tough that first year. It was an adjustment along all of those lines. I didn't fit in socially. I found myself not black enough for black people, and not white enough for white people. And so you're in this hinterland, uh, because I'd been sheltered for most of my life. So I didn't have a lot of the social cues. I did not have any of the understanding of how to navigate college, managing your time, taking notes, going to see professors. I knew none of that. Didn't know how to do any of that. All I had was this raw intellect that came from a love of reading. That was it. So being judged like that was difficult, but not so much so that I couldn't deal with it, because I was not going back to the Robinson home.
Yeah.
So, right. I mean, so it's all relative.
Hmm.
But I will tell you what began to happen as a series of conversations in my freshman year. And I realized that these kids were pretty sheltered, actually, and that they had not seen what I had seen. They had not endured what I had endured. And I realized that here, not all, but some of them questioning whether or not I belong there. And at one point, I was having an argument on my dorm floor my freshman year, and I just blurted out something that became almost a quasi mantra as I thought about it. I said, I know that I can survive in this world. I said, but I'm pretty damn sure none of you could have survived in the world that I've come from. And I remember how quiet they all got. And there was nothing more to be said after that. I've seen more of life. And now later on, they asked me, well, what did you mean by that? And I said, I walked onto this dorm floor my freshman year. As I watched, as I said at the beginning of the year, and I said, your mother and father dropped you off. I don't even know who my mother and father are or where they are. So this idea that I don't have what it takes to survive here, those are your judgments and perceptions, not anchored in any real reality. And that was an important moment, because I think it's true for any of us, where there are many attempts to define us and frame us out in the world. And you have to decide, what's your lighthouse? What are you sailing your life towards?
Yeah. I'm curious, love, right? You hadn't necessarily had a reference point of what good parental love was, obviously for the year and a half that
Hmm.
John was there for you as a
Yeah.
father figure probably definitely helped.
Hmm.
Whether it's even friendships, or girls, in terms of relationships, um, how did you deal with that? I mean, you had been through a lot of trauma.
Hmm. Well, in a few ways, I did have a frame of reference, and it was what not to be and what not to do. So you can have those affirming role models, but role models aren't always positive ones. They're also people who show you a way not to be, a way what not to become. And so my role models were a lot of those. It was a lot of that. And I said, okay, that's not at all what I want to be. You just say, okay, that's not it. That is not it. And I think sometimes being what you never had is all the motivation one needs. So I didn't have a example of being a good husband, but I became one. Didn't have example either in the foster father or in my biological father of a good example of what um, of how to be a father. Um, but I'd like to think that I am one because within me is always the void of what never was. And it doesn't matter how accomplished one is or how successful one becomes or what title you have or how much the world shouts your name, you still walk through the world with voids that of things that can never be. I take enormous joy in my children. My younger son Vaughn, who I tease and I say, we probably should have nicknamed you. We should have called you Stephen Jr. because he's so much like me.
Yeah.
And he was telling that he's in college, and so he was describing to me a time when kids were teasing him about something, and he says, you guys, you don't realize my dad's a famous author, and he was like putting me to them as a way to deal with their teasing him over one thing or another. And I thought, in that moment, the ability to point at me and say, that's my father, is not something I will ever have. I can't point to, right? And I was never able to point to, but they can. And that I think is healing. I think love is maybe the hardest part of it, was the hardest part of it all, because to share that vulnerability can be difficult because it's a risk. You got to risk. You got to risk getting rejected, denied, which you've already dealt with a lot. So why would I want to do that and put myself through that? And well, because you run the risk of never finding it. You'll run the risk of not finding the very thing that can fully heal you, which is love. And so you're going to have to risk something in order to do that.
Did you ever feel, obviously in some ways you knew the Robinsons were not right, but the years and years of them telling you you're worthless and things like that, that's going to have an effect on you. Um, did you ever feel like you weren't worthy of love, of like, or I'm not stable enough based on my past to, be someone's girlfriend or things like that? Did you ever deal with anything like that?
I didn't.
Yeah.
And the reason I didn't was because of the vision that I saw through how much I read. See, I knew that they were the outliers. I knew that they were the aberration. I knew that something was wrong with them, not with me. And that now I didn't understand what motivated them. I was really too young to understand, but they were like, I don't know, they were like the villains in the book. You know, they were like the Joker, you know. um, any villain that the superhero had to deal with, that's who they were to me. And so it made it a lot, in many ways, it made it easier to navigate because that attempt to try and make me feel like I was not worthy was almost laughable to me, almost laughable. And, you know, I knew certainly from the conversations in the home that I never thought about them as being educated. I never said that they're not educated people, but I did know I was smarter than them. And so nothing they said about me, I ever took at face value, ever, like nothing. And so if they said it was up, then it must be down. You know, that's how I thought about it.
In terms of your time at BC, do you, I don't know if you mentally remember this or not, but um, did you kind of compartmentalize all of this time period away and kind of like not in a sense forget about it, but like just in order to thrive in this environment, was
Mm-hmm.
that your mindset, or did you keep it with you as motivation, or how did you mentally once you're in the midst of this environment of college, and you know you already had a year and a half with John, so you had some level of normalcy?
Yeah. Well, I think what you want more than anything else, like most of the kids will in those situations tell you, and you said it there briefly, what you want is normalcy. You want to be normal, and you want to do the things that your high school classmates do, your college classmates do. And so if you find yourself getting dragged, pardon me, into a different kind of conversation all the time, then normalcy doesn't come. And so for me, this was very much about, no, I want to feel normal. I want to do what everybody else is doing. And I also developed this feeling that I just didn't want anybody feeling sorry for me. And it was the, you know, pity or anything like that reminded me of the way people looked at me when I was a young boy, and I didn't want to be pitied. You know, I didn't want that. And so the best thing to do is just to keep it to myself, you know, and say nothing. And one, I got to be normal, and two, I didn't have to worry about anybody pitying me.
Yeah. So after Boston College, you were in academia for a little bit. Eventually moved up to the senior assistant director of admissions at Boston College. You know, any thoughts on working in higher ed, or any lessons that you would pass on to anybody to think about or reflect on um, working in academia?
Well, I do think, generally speaking, of education as the great equalizer. And that's why I was drawn to it, because I knew how powerful and impactful a college acceptance letter can be. It was certainly impactful to me. And so my years as a college admissions officer, was my signature on that acceptance letter, meant a whole lot to me. And the ability it provides one to reframe not just your own life, but generations to come. We're having this conversation in our home the other day. I was having with my daughter, who's our youngest child, And I was sharing with her that her great grandmother did not go to high school. She worked on a farm. Her grandmother went to high school. Her mother went to college and graduate school. And so I said, Kennedy, you see the progression, right, through the generations. So education to me is that great equalizer. And as Frederick Douglass said, education quite literally brings you up from slavery. And that's where I was, certainly. It provides options. It gives you choices. And that's why I was drawn to it. And anything else that's mission centered. I found it to be it has this transformative power. And I loved words and learning, and I still do.
Yeah. During this time period, you meet your wife, Tonya. I'm just curious, as you look back on that, is there any advice that you would give to single people or finding love or knowing, the person's the one or, anything with regards to love?
Man, I can tell you the story of how we met is it's almost to me a mini course in risks and love and how fairy tales can turn out. So I was on Martha's Vineyard off the coast of Massachusetts with a group of friends. I was working in college admissions at the time. And there were about 8 of us. And we were walking down the street, and there's music pumping from car stereos, and it's summertime. I mean, it's nice. And we pass a group of women, about 8 of them, and we pass each other. And I find myself standing next to a young woman who introduces herself. We talk for maybe 5 minutes. I learned that she was from New Jersey, and she was with a bunch of her friends. And so my friend comes over to me, and he points down at her hand, and he kind of whispers it almost like the Shakespearean aside, but he wants me to hear it. And he says, hey, man, we got to go. And besides, and he points down at her hand, and she had an engagement ring on. And I had seen her engagement ring. And I said, no, it's not really about that. And she smiled, and we parted ways. Well, a year later, we're back on Martha's Vineyard, and I see this very stunning woman who's staring at me. And every time I kind of looked in her direction, she'd make eye contact with me. Yeah. And then she walks over to me and she says, I know you. And I said, in a moment of utter stupidity, but it was more shock, actually. I said, you do? But it came out the wrong way. It kind of came out like, oh, you do. Oh, you do, huh? Oh. And so, what she does in that moment, which is a lesson, I think, for young women when they want to send a message to a man about how they expect to be treated. She touches me lightly on the forearm, kind of past my forearm lightly, and she says, I must be mistaken. And she walked away. And Arnav, I was like, oh my, now when I said you do, here's what I was thinking. This woman is so memorable. How in the world do you know her? Does she know you and you don't know her? So that's what I was thinking. And so she's walking away, and I'm like, think. I'm like, I remember. This is the woman from last year. This is her. So I went over to her, I tapped her lightly on the shoulder, and she wheeled around and looked at me like, you? And I put my hands up like in self-defense. I didn't want her to, whack me. And I said, I'm sorry. I said, I remember you now. We met last year on Martha's Vineyard, right across the street from Man Martha's ice cream shop. You had on yellow shorts, a blue Parker. Your name is Tonya, but I remember your friends calling you T, so that's your nickname. And you're a teacher. And the reason I didn't remember you is because your hair was pulled back. And she smiled and she said, so you do remember. And I said, yes, I do remember. And from that point forward, she never, it has never, some 26 years later, I've never forgotten her. But I should also tell you, Arnav, I probably issued the greatest line in the history of dating ever. Like this is the greatest line ever. I'm just going to tell you that right now. It's the greatest line ever. Now remember, she's there with her girlfriends again. And every time when we meet the second time, every time that they're together, I'm there. Because I know that she's the one. I know she's the one. And so she was no longer engaged. She had broken it off. And for the next 3 days, wherever she was, I was. They were having dinner. I still remember doing this too. There were 8 of them were having dinner in a restaurant. And she told me they were going to be having dinner. And I walked in right when they were having dinner and pulled up a chair. And they were looking at me like, who is this dude, right? Now, what they tell her is, I said, hey, every time we're together, he's around. This is like the girls' night. This is a girls' weekend. And they say to her, you don't even know his last name. And she tells me this. And I said to her, well, please tell your friends that my last name is Pemberton. And they really should remember it because one day that's going to be your name too. Yeah. Greatest line in the history of dating.
Confidence, yeah.
And we were married less than a year after that. Wow. And that was 26 years ago.
Yeah. Not to go to a serious point, but how much or at what point did you tell her about your past?
We began dating in late August. So we met in July, and we were talking on the phone for a lot of July and August, it felt like. And I would just say I grew up in foster care. And the reason was because if you shared the details of what you went through, then you do worry that people are going to see you as damaged goods, because it's really hard for them to reconcile the story you're telling them and the person in front of you. Does he have some dark chapters? Does he have, there's no way somebody could come through that and be as intact as he appears to be, that you would still see the smoke on him, so to speak, from the fire that he's been through. And I think for me, I had to be cautious about it. I had to be guarded. But anything she ever asked me, I always told her. So if she asked me, I always gave her an honest answer. Always. Whether she was going to accept it, like it, receive it or not was, but I always gave her an honest answer. And what I came to learn about her early on is that, she had been through a journey herself. Her father was addicted to cocaine most of her life. He passed away in 2019, and it was always a source of great pain that he was not in her life. So she understood that desire to build something better, and she recognized that in me. And I, of course, I saw that in her too. And even to this day, Arnav, it's one of the things that continues to drive our bond. It's how we've raised our family. It's how we've raised our children. And we just have enormous, that sense of shared values, that you're on a similar kind of mission, to be what you didn't have. Now, I should tell you, had an angel of a mother. I mean, her mother remains one of the most special people that I've ever encountered. We lost her mother last summer. And, as you might expect, it's difficult. We miss her very, very much.
Yeah.
Enormous respect for her mother. Single mom, never complained, was dealing with her own heartbreak, but she was resolved that her daughter and her son were going to have a great foundation, and they did. They did. So, Tonya and I all talk all the time about, the sense of shared values, that we have, that we both wanted the same things. So I say for people, young people who are dating, one, take the risk, ask her out, ask him out. You get rejected, so what? So what? Don't be the person who's 70 years old saying, I let that one get away. Like, don't be that person. Two greatest experiences, two of the greatest emotions in the human condition are love and regret. And those two can be intertwined. And so I don't want regret to be part of how I navigate the world. I don't want to have that. And I think when you're willing to risk, which is the other thing I say, when you're willing to risk, you will have to risk something for love. You have to risk something for love. But you'll find it brings you joys that you could not have even remotely imagined. I also think that accepting people as they are is important. It's important not to get caught up in the superficial, because that's always passing, but to have that sense of shared mission, shared values about small things and about big things brings you for me anyway, being an advocate of marriage and of relationships, I'd say it brings you more joy than kind of being alone and like by yourself. Yeah.
How honest were you with your kids on your story? Did you wait for them to get a certain age, or how did you address that aspect?
The minute my feeling was, as soon as they asked me, I'm going to tell them. Now, how I answered that question when they were 7 is different than at 17, but I was always honest. And in fact, it was Quinn, our oldest. He was the reason that I wrote A Chance in the World in the first place. He was the reason, because he was asking me, where was my mother and father? The book is my response to him and his brother Vaughn and their sister Kennedy. And I'm of the belief that, children don't always listen, but they rarely fail to follow. And if you put good examples in front of them, if you share with them what are challenges and struggles, in time they understand them. It might take them some time, but in time they do. And we do talk fairly often about, kind of one decision or another. You and I are talking when the day after, Will Smith strode up to the stage and you know, assigned to him a label that he probably, I hope he regrets it anyway. I hope.
Yeah.
And so we were on a family chat and we were talking about that. We were talking about controlling one's emotions. We were talking about, the importance of using words and language, to convey, to get your point across. I think it's always giving a different frame of reference for how you deal with a problem and or a situation. And that ties back to, my own life experience, which I conveyed to the kids. I said, what you saw Will Smith do, that's the home I grew up in. Somebody offends you, you whacked him. And it was with a lot more than just an open hand, by the way. But there was no good outcome to that. What was achieved? What was made better? Nothing. Nothing was achieved or made better. And back to that earlier point, you can take example and learn what not to do. Right?
Yeah.
Like, don't do that,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious, did you fear, what would happen to your business career, coming out with this book in 2012?
No, it was my truth. It was one that I needed to write. I was very hopeful that anybody who read it would accept it. But the truth of the matter is, I didn't think beyond some friends and my family, meaning Tonya and the kids, that anybody was going to read it. I wasn't really writing it for any commercial appeal. Now it became that, but I wasn't writing it for that purpose. So it was very liberating, actually. It's true for anything. Whether you create music or paint a canvas, when you write it without regard, or create it without regard for audience, or not letting the audience be the primary driver, just throw that paint on the wall, you find it gives you a degree of creativity. It gives you a degree of freedom that allows you to quite literally create your best work. And so I would say that there will always be those who are going to have their opinion, always. And I would say that sharing your truth is what is one's responsibility. And if somebody doesn't like that, then maybe they should write their own.
Yeah. I'm curious, what was the point where, like, maybe, right, when people go through tough emotional childhoods, right, they often don't like to talk about it because it triggers them. But obviously you've written a book, you've done many speaking engagements. Obviously you've gotten to a point where you're comfortable,
Yeah.
with revisiting these things. Do you know what age you maybe got better and weren't as triggered and were more comfortable talking about it?
I don't think it ever really, triggered me in the way that we come to think about those things now. I think the first inkling of it, I don't know, began when I was in college and I volunteered at the Copley Public Library. And I volunteered there to bring to kids the importance of higher education. And so when I did, I was talking about the college admissions process. And as I was talking about the college admissions process, I can tell you that I really did think that I was just talking to them about the mechanics of college admissions. That's what I thought. And then I realized that it really wasn't so much about maybe college admissions. It was more about worthiness of being college material. And I think for me, that was probably the first sign. Pardon me while I plug in here. Yeah, that was the first sign for me that something I now fully understand, which is, that sometimes when one endures challenge or difficulty, what is gained from that is not necessarily for you, right? That maybe that's for somebody else. And it's an audience that is different when you think about it in that context. Because if you're only focused on you, then you might not see how invaluable and how important and impactful that is for somebody else. And so my comfortability comes from now knowing, especially after the book was written, that when I wrote my life story, I was writing chapters of other people's lives, including yours. There's something unifying and healing about that. When you realize that, one, we all have a story. Two, none of us look like that story. Three, we have mutual chapters. All of us do. That have nothing to do with your race, your gender, your faith expression, your political expression. Whether you have money or don't have money, title or don't have title, there's this common experience that's called life that we have. And a lot of our challenge in the world today is because we have forgotten that, if we ever understood it at all. So I think I know your story by looking at your name. You might think you know my story. Well, in this case, you actually do. But let's say we passed each other.
Yeah.
And, there's a way that we're socialized. And I should tell you or share my feeling that is quite skillful, how our emotions are manipulated and how we are told stories about each other that don't reflect realities. That happens often enough to all of us where we say, I had no idea that person was. I had no idea that. Well, that's true for everybody you meet. Everybody has something you had no idea about. That's the power and the impact of conversation, of sharing, of understanding that. So if you go into every conversation, not trying to locate somebody, what are their political views? Who they vote for? What's their faith? And approach conversations thinking, I have something in common with this person. And the magic is trying to find out what that is. So in the Lighthouse Effect, I wrote about a train ride I was on from New York to Washington, D.C., introduced to a woman by a mutual friend, three of us sitting together. And she was asking me about the book I was writing. And I shared with her kind of the cruising altitude parts of it. And she at one point says, I was saying in a tone like, do you have any idea what I'm talking about? I didn't say it quite that way. I assumed that she wasn't, that she had no idea. And she says, well, actually, I do, because I just met my father for the first time a few years ago.
Wow.
I had no clue, right? I had no clue. I had no idea. She had a story, right? She and I had a common story. And I wound up writing about her in The Lighthouse Effect.
Yeah. So we were technically at the end of BC, you're doing the senior assistant director. You transition into business and obviously have found a lot of success. Within 6 years, you're at a chief diversity officer level at Monster.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, what advice do you have or what lessons have you learned in making those strides to getting to the positions you have gotten to, at three different organizations, being a C-suite executive?
It is so important for us to keep being a student. A a relentless, unapologetic student. Always keep being a student. There is something so valuable about that kind of hunger and the kind of curiosity about the world. You have to be so protective of what you're digesting. What you're thinking about, right? If you spend most of your days doom scrolling or taking up the latest PR. I mean, I see the content that gets created on social media, and I'm thinking, like, what is that really about? You know, what's that about? You're trying to go viral, okay? Like, what's that going to do to better the world? I'm not. You know, what is that going to do? You know.
Yeah.
And this is a time where we need people who are invested in solving the great challenges of our time, and to find that common humanity. Now, wherever that path takes you is wherever that path takes you. I think the sense of being of service to one another matters. Doesn't mean I'm not saying take an oath of poverty, but I am saying find what gives you joy. That is also about touching and impacting somebody else's life. That is immeasurable. And again, it is what is so desperately needed in the world today.
Yeah. Well, Steve, I want to be respectful of the time I requested. So, you know, as we look to close, you know, is there anything else, you know, obviously people can gather from this interview, you know, you're a very accomplished individual. You know, I only got to one business question, and you know, because you know you've had such a remarkable life. Is there any other, you know, life lesson that you would pass on, or some reflecting thought that you think others could think about?
A lot of that is summarized in the follow-up that I wrote to A Chance in the World. It didn't take me 10 years to write it. It took me 10 years to come up with the idea, because I did not know what I wanted to write as a follow-up. I didn't want to write about me again. So I knew what I didn't want to do, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And it occurred to me that over the years since A Chance in the World was published, I had encountered the stories of so many other people who were extraordinary in their seemingly ordinariness. And I learned something from those people. I met them as a young boy, as a younger man, later on in life, as recently as a few years ago. And in each case, they made me stop. And so their imprint upon the world, the way in which they impacted me, were, in essence, what I have come to call the Lighthouse Effect. They are lighthouses for me, and lighthouses for us all, because they embody all the attributes of the lighthouse. They turn our doubts into destinations, because that's what John Sykes did for me. Carmen, who I met on the train, she helped remind me that the first picture is not the full story. The woman who gave me books was doing so at the advice of her mother, who said, "Give from where you are with whatever you have." F.L. Kirby, who was on the battlefields of Vietnam and had this courage to encourage. Monica and Rajiv Tipnis, who lost their daughter to a mental health crisis. The Pete family, whose son RJ had a diagnosis of autism, and in that moment pivoted from the circumstance to the possibilities. These are for the most part, everyday people. Wells Crowther, who brought 18 people to safety on the morning of 9/11 and embodied another one of the attributes of the lighthouse, which is to be selfless. Rick Rock, who lost his father on Father's Day to a sudden heart attack when he was just 16 years old, and he was home alone with him. And it spurred him to a life of medicine because he said he never wanted to be in a position where he could not help again. And these are people all around me, but they're also all around us. And as I said, these people are closer than we might think that they are. So the Lighthouse Effect, Arnav, is a metaphor for living, for learning, for leading. The orphan story that I shared with you earlier, that was also my uncle's story, who I met 15 years later, who was also orphaned, wow, who also had one encounter with his mother and never saw her again, who had a distant, if you could even call it that, relationship with his father, and yet became a successful physical therapist, raised 3 beautiful children. And he is my biological uncle. And who would have known, right? Yeah. We all have these common threads. And I would ask all of us to try and spend some part of each day trying to find those common threads. It really can and does and will better the world.
Yeah. Well, Steve, if people want to support you, what's the best way for them to do that?
A few ways. You can find me on social media, all the traditional ones: Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. If you're not on social media, you can always go to stevepemberton.io. You can leave me a message. I always love hearing from people all the time. And I do respond. It might take me some time, but I do respond. Those are 2 best ways. I also, along with Carmen Ortiz-McGee, actually have launched a master class where we walk you through the Lighthouse Effect, and that can be found on fierce.com. So a lot of ways to find me.
Awesome. Well, Steve, I just want to acknowledge you. It was incredible getting to do my research for this interview and learning your story. And I hope, there are days you can kind of, I don't know, third person reflect on what an amazing individual you are in terms of overcoming all the adversity that you had to, and just, being a beacon of light from that, husband, father of 3, all that, from an orphan. It gives us all hope. I mean, we didn't get to talk about this, but for anybody else out there, there's a movie on Steve's story as well. That's he's been on Steve Harvey, he's been on the Today Show. It's a story that has impacted the world, and that's you. I'm speaking to that person. And that's really cool. And I just think it's awesome that you're continuing it with the Lighthouse Effect book, which is, again, a great message. And so, Steve, I just want to thank you for doing all this. You're a C-suite level executive. You don't need to do any of this. This is takes a lot of your time and things like that. But I mean, as with the Lighthouse Effect, you have no idea what the effect of this is in terms of people that have had traumatic childhoods or are orphans or grew up in foster care or whatever. It's awesome what you've done, and thank you for everything you're doing.
Arnav, I am so honored. I have done a lot of interviews over the years, and I can always discern who has really spent the time. And it's very clear to me that you have. I so appreciate the investment. I also appreciate you understanding that I was trying to tell a deeper story than just my own. And not everybody sees that, in all honesty. So I appreciate all of that, and then some. The time definitely flew by.
Yeah. Thank you again.
Thank you, Anna. We'll see you soon.